To the cloud. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, I suppose, and welcome to the webinar of Measuring Non-Degree Credential Attainment. Today, we're going to be discussing the value of non-degree credentials to state labor markets, the ways that states are collecting data about non-degree credentials, and basically how states are trying to better understand the ways that the skills of their state's residents are aligning with labor market demand. Just a brief note about how our software works. In order to ask a question, there's a Q&A box with a Q inside of a square, and it should be located in the toolbar on the bottom of your screen. The toolbar might disappear after some inactivity on your computer. If you need to use the toolbar, you can move your cursor to locate it. You can ask questions throughout the webinar, and they will be answered at the end. Our director, Brian Wilson, will be facilitating our Q&A session. I'm having some slide difficulties. All right, so for those of you who aren't familiar, my name is Jenna Leventoff. I'll be facilitating our panel discussion today. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Workforce Data Quality Campaign. I think many of you are likely familiar with WDQC, but if you're not, WDQC is a project of the National Skills Coalition. The National Skills Coalition is a nonpartisan policy and advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C., and we work at the federal and state levels to advance policies that close the skills gap for middle skill jobs. WDQC, we like to consider ourselves a data branch of National Skills Coalition, and we promote data policies that can help narrow the middle skills gap. I am extremely pleased to welcome our panelists today. We have Jeremy Kinsell from the Department of Education in Missouri, who will be talking about how Missouri collects non-credit program data. We have Ryan Murphy from Iowa, who will be talking about how Iowa collects registered apprenticeship data, and Jonathan Attridge from the Tennessee Department of Education, filling in for Casey Hogner-Wren today, and he'll be talking about how Tennessee has industry certification data. A brief overview of where we're going today. We're going to start with an overview of what non-degree credentials actually are, because the concept can have different meanings and different understandings across the field, as well as an outline of what state attainment goals are. Then I'll move into the results of WDQC's recent Measuring Non-Degree Credentials scan. Then we're going to get to the exciting part where our panelists are going to talk about why non-degree credentials have value in their states, and then they're going to talk a little bit more about how they're able to get and use data about non-degree credentials. So just to outline the things that we're talking about, there's 4 particularly common types of non-degree credentials, and that's going to be the focus of our conversation today. The first one is industry certification. So these are credentials. They're usually not awarded by schools, but most likely outside entities. So I tend to think of the Manufacturing Skills Standards Council. They require an exam to show that a person's achieved the designated skills, and they're probably going to need to be renewed periodically. Then certificates, these are usually awarded by educational institutions like community colleges. I know many of you tuning into the webinar today are from community colleges, so they're based upon the completions of some sort of program of study. That could be a 4-credit program of study or a non-credit program of study. Could be the result of tests, but usually once you have a certificate, it doesn't need to be renewed. Apprenticeship certificates are similar. They're awarded based upon the completion of the requirements of some sort of apprenticeship program. which can be a registered or a non-registered apprenticeship program. And then licenses are credentials that permit the holder to practice in a specific field. So you can think of, you need a license to become a nurse. These licenses are usually awarded by government entities based on some sort of predetermined criteria that can include, completing a course of study, earning some sort of credential, taking a test. Licenses are usually going to be time limited, and they're going to have to be renewed periodically. Non-degree credentials are so incredibly useful to workers and employers. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, about 22% of adults in the U.S. have some sort of professional certification or license. Another 9% have an educational certificate. And then the full-time workers that have these non-degree credentials earn more than those without. To put some sort of quantification on that, according to the Georgetown Center on Education in the Workforce, there's about 30 million good jobs in the U.S. today that you don't need a BA, but they have median earnings of $55,000 a year. So non-degree credentials are really, really helping state residents to get those well-paying jobs in the labor market. The next thing I want to talk about are state attainment goals, because I'm aware that not everyone on this webinar is necessarily immersed in the post-secondary world. But 41 states have attainment goals, and these are goals for the percentage of the adult population that has some sort of post-secondary credential. The statewide attainment goals are usually seeking to increase the educational levels of the adult population in a state, and they're usually aligned to address the workforce needs of the state. So it could be 50% by 2025 or a handful of goals. If you hear those sort of taglines, that's probably talking about a state post-secondary attainment goal. And a lot of these goals actually include non-degree credentials. They'll say, we're looking for degrees, we're also counting certificates, we're also counting licenses, anything that's going to help our students find a good job in the labor market. So because of a lot of these goals are actually including non-degree credentials, it's really, really essential to understand who's getting non-degree credentials. And that's why we wanted to host this webinar today. We wanted to really draw the point home that this data is essential towards measuring progress for attainment goals and just for really better understanding your state. So in order to measure whether states are meeting their attainment goals or just understanding their supply of workers, the state representatives that are on the line should really think about collecting data from an array of non-degree credential programs. This can include registered apprenticeship certificates, non-credit certificates, industry certifications, licenses, every type of credential I just talked about. And then it's important for states to start incorporating that data into a longitudinal data system. For those of you on the line who aren't familiar with a longitudinal data system, it's a data system that brings together information from across the education and workforce spectrum. So it includes data about traditional K-12 programs, about career and technical education programs, post-secondary. It'll contain information about employment outcomes. And when all of that data is put together, you can find strong career pathways and understand the outcomes of your students. Then we also think it's really important for states to have a process to identify some sort of credential of value. So there's so many non-degree credentials out there. Most of them are fabulous, but just to make a lot of states are concerned that what if this one isn't as good as I think it is? And so we're really encouraging states to think about what their state values and what's their credential of value in their state. WDQC actually, we have some criteria that states can consider in our recently released Measuring Non-Degree Credentials 101 guide. It's available on the National Skills Coalition website, and I think it was just released last week. The next thing, just to set the landscape of sort of where states are in collecting and incorporating data about non-degree credentials into their SLDS. WD recently, within the past couple months, did a scan of all 50 states and the District of Columbia, asking to what extent states are collecting individual level data about non-degree credentials. So data about whether Sally Joe has a non-degree credential, whether they're incorporating that data into their longitudinal data system so that they can identify strong pathways and employment outcomes, and then whether they're also identifying credentials of value. The scan outlines also a couple of best practices. So I encourage you to read that if you're from a state and you're wondering what the best practices are for collecting non-degree credentials data. We're going to be discussing a couple of them here today with our panelists. We're really excited about that, but there's a bit more in the scan. The survey was completed by actually all 50 states and the District of Columbia. It contains self-reported data from representatives from higher education and workforce agencies, as well as from state longitudinal data systems. The scan ultimately found that While no state has all of the individual level data about every single type of non-degree credential, states are making so much progress. They're the most likely to have data on 4-credit certificate programs, registered apprenticeship programs, and licenses. As you can see, more than half of states have all or most data about 4-credit certificates and apprenticeship certificates. States are the least likely to have data about non-credit certificates, about industry certifications, and registered apprenticeship certificates from, or excuse me, non-registered apprenticeship certificates. The scan also found that states are really interested, and in fact, the majority of them are collecting data about demographics. This is going to help states understand if a non-degree credential is serving all populations equally well. It's going to help them find the best pathway for particular subpopulations of interest. So states are the most likely to collect information about age, students' race or ethnicity, gender, their highest level of educational attainment, as well as their status in the military. The scan also found that states are incorporating a lot of this data into their state longitudinal data systems. Again, this is so important because it helps not only states create an unduplicated count of how many people are getting at least one type of non-degree credential, but it's also helping to measure the employment outcomes of these credentials. So most states include 4-credit certificates in their SLDS, but they're still working to incorporate the rest. So that's an area where there's some progress that's going to be made probably shortly. Our scan also asked states whether they're trying to identify credentials of value. And in fact, the majority are 30 states that they either will or are in the process of doing so. And to do this, there's a couple of particular activities that states are doing. They're utilizing labor market information so that they can better understand in-demand industries and occupations. They're looking at skills gaps. They're engaging with employers to learn what they're looking for when they're hiring or promoting workers. And they're also examining the employment and wage outcomes of credential completers. So I am quite excited now to turn the discussion over away from me and these slides and to some of our panelists from the states. I think it's a really interesting question, not just to consider, again, how this data is collected, but why. You know, all of these states have some sort of policy reason in place for why they're working on collecting this data. And so I want to start the discussion there and ask states why non-degree credentials are important in their state. So Jeremy, I think you're unmuted. Let's start with you. In the past year, Missouri has begun collecting data about non-credit programs from all of Missouri's public institutions. So can you talk a little bit about why Missouri is doing this? It seems like, at least to me, like it's a lot of effort and not something a ton of states are doing. So I'd have to assume that the state sees a lot of value in non-credit certificates. Can you talk a little bit about that?
We do, and you talked a little bit about the workforce outcomes of those credentials, which we believe are absolutely important and absolutely valid. And in our case, in our state, I think historically have been absolutely invisible in some cases. And we collect, as many states do, we collect just a broad range of information on the credit side of the house, as we've called it, particularly from the two-year institutions, and that we've done a great job collecting information on the credit credentials, but the non-credit credentials is this whole other side of the house that really hasn't been visible to the state, visible to policymakers, I should say, and that that in some cases the institutions haven't really got due credit for. So we've taken some steps over the course of the last few years to strengthen that collection and to get more data on some of those credentials. You mentioned all the apprenticeships, the licensure, the industry credentials, although those can be problematic for various reasons in terms of data collection, but in terms of making those more visible and getting a better accounting of the outcomes that students can get by enrolling in those, and completing in those programs. So, and you mentioned attainment goals as well too, and Missouri has one. We've committed to have 60% of our working population have a high quality credential, a certificate or above by the year 2025. And right now, I think many of the folks on the line probably know that that census does not collect information directly on certificate attainment. So there are various approaches out there for estimating that. We've come up with one as well. Based on our estimate, we believe we're at about 51% right now, so we've got some room to grow. But we're not going to grow unless we focus on it. Part of focusing on it is collecting some of that data, and we've had a great collaboration in our state amongst the institutions, amongst state actors, economic development, workforce development, community college leadership particularly, and we believe we're off to a great start.
So Jeremy, I mean, I assume you said you're currently at 51%. Does the Missouri State leaders view non-credit certificates as one of the key ways of getting to that 60% goal?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we know that there are so many occupational workforce opportunities for these students. You mentioned skills gap analysis as well. We're embarking on a major project this summer in consultation with the Department of Economic Development and other stakeholders to figure out, to take a renewed look at what those skills gaps are. But we believe those non-credit credentials that lead into, that lead into the trades, that lead into some technical technology-based work that we haven't been able to track before, play a huge role in that. And that, there certainly is interest in support from leadership, and again, making those programs more visible, collecting more data on those outcomes. Absolutely.
I think it's really interesting to think of these non-degree credentials as like a key way of reaching some of those less traditional populations and a key way of making sure that states are training their workers. And I'm guessing, Ryan, you'll be up next. Things are probably really similar in Iowa. So as background for the audience, Iowa has an agreement with the U.S. Department of Labor to get data about people that are registered in registered apprenticeship programs in Iowa. So Ryan, what are the policy reasons behind Iowa collecting that data? Same question to you as to Jeremy.
Sure, good afternoon. Iowa has been interested in registered apprenticeships for some time now, but more recently, a report by the Georgetown Center on Education in the Workforce in 2015 predicted that 68% of the jobs in Iowa require some education and or training beyond high school by the year 2025. This was the call to action for many of our policymakers to get Iowa focused on all types of post-secondary education and training. In part with the National Government Association grant, the Future Ready Iowa initiative was created. That initiative promotes education and training overall, but also is focused on aligning education and training with high-demand jobs in our state. Iowa's educational and training attainment goal is set at 70%, 10% higher than Missouri's, just wanted to point that out. But they have some post-secondary training or education by 2025 again. The reason registered apprenticeships are such an important part of the Future Ready Iowa initiative is that many of the jobs are in high demand, have registered apprenticeship programs already set up for them. The registered apprenticeship model is definitely in alignment with the job need, which is perfectly fit with the Future Ready Iowa goals. Iowa is using multiple data sources currently to monitor and measure our movement related to that registered apprenticeship and to the Future Ready Iowa attainment goal. And that Department of Labor agreement and data extracts that we get from them is key to that. Another reason is for Iowa to reach our Future Ready Iowa goal of 70% of, we know that we are going to have to reach populations that are people who are over the age of 25 who either haven't completed some type of credential or certificate, but also those that have a high school diploma or less. This is a great option for them. Especially for those who are also looking to make a career change, a registered apprenticeship will allow them to build their skills, pay their bills, and not accumulate student debt. In order, again, for us to reach that 70%, we will depend on many adult Iowans to find a path to a credential, and that path is going to have to work for their life situation. Registered apprenticeship provides more flexibility between time, income, and life. And so when you're at that age, you have many balls in the air that you need to juggle. And so a registered apprenticeship does provide that flexibility.
Yeah, Ryan, that's such a good point. So many people can't afford to stop feeding their families in order to move, to get a credential that they need. And so it seems like apprenticeships are going to become even more of a popular option, I guess, moving forward, because they provide that flexibility so that you can earn money and learn a valuable skill all at the same time. I think that's a really good point that I just want to reiterate. And Jonathan, don't want to forget about you. I'm going to pose the same question, but preface it by saying Tennessee is a little bit different from the other states on this webinar. So Jonathan's from the Tennessee Department of Education, and their non-degree data collection of industry certifications is at the K-12 level. The state actually has a data sharing agreement with a number of private industry certifiers. So, Jonathan, can you talk about the value of industry certifications at the K-12 level and kind of explain how, you know, this isn't just an issue at the post-secondary level, K-12 is involved too, and the whole state can be interested in it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jenna. I think, you know, like the other panelists, I think that it comes back to the attainment goals that our state has set. And in Tennessee, we have the drive to 55. And where K-12 plays an important role in that is to create this, what we call a robust, aligned learning pathway. And so that starts in elementary school and goes all the way through the career opportunities that those students are choosing. Our belief is that there have to be multiple entry and exit points along that career path. Starts in elementary school with career exploration. In high school, we think about banking credentials. That includes early post-secondary credits for students and industry certification. We hope that those are then seamlessly transitioned into that student's post-secondary plan of their choice. I think that you know, the way that we've really, you know, put our money where our mouth is we've actually embedded industry certification in our definition of what we call a ready graduate, which is part of our state accountability system that we submitted through our Every Student Succeeds Act plan. So we actually, you know, have a pathway for our students in high school to earn an industry certification that demonstrates what we believe is readiness for the next step. We have these data sharing agreements with, at this point, nearly 40 different vendors, 80 or so different certifications. I'll talk a little bit later about how we get to that. But I think that, you know, we really find value because you know, we want to make sure that in high school we are preparing students for that next step, that we're not, you know, that this is part of these multiple entry and exit points that are aligned with that student's path.
So another thing I want to ask you about, Jonathan, Tennessee actually has a list of industry certifications that they're hoping that their K-12 students achieve. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So I think, you know, especially the folks that are working for states are really interested in that. They want to know how their state can sort of weed through all of the industry certifications out there and figure out what are the good ones. So I know that Tennessee actually has some criteria and a process for doing that. Can you talk a little bit about that now?
Yeah, absolutely. So in Tennessee, we realigned our career and technical education to the 16 recognized career clusters. And any industry certification that is promoted by the department must go through the same process, which it must be recognized and valued by industry, which means that the industry advisory councils, which are composed of representatives from that industry, must look at that certification, recognize it, and value it. So there's we can't just, if it's just recognized, but they're not actually using it and they're saying they're using it, then it doesn't count. Each industry certification needs to align with the course within one of the programs of study. We also need to have partnerships with our post-secondary institutions to understand how those certifications can transfer to the post-secondary level. And then, you know, the fourth piece of that is the transfers to high-quality employment. So this is the piece where we really rely on our industry leaders. Each of our career clusters has an advisory council that works to make that declaration. Now, you know, over the years as we've been doing this, there have been some certifications that we've added to the initial list. You know, when the first lists were put out, we had about half of the number of certifications that we started with that were within those aligned programs of study. As we've heard from our industry partners and from our schools and districts who have promoted and requested information about this, they'll say, well, let's look at this specific industry certification, and it will go through that vetting process. So recently we announced 21 new additional certifications that are promoted by the state. There are other certifications that students can pursue, but those aren't necessarily promoted by the state.
So it sounds like employers play pretty big role in that. So like Tennessee is really paying attention to that industry demand side of the equation.
They're central to the process.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. So I think all of that context is really helpful for the audience just to get a better sense of, you know, these states aren't just collecting data for data's sake. There's real reason behind it and value behind it, and it's so essential to so many of the state's education and workforce policies. But with that sort of out of the way, I do want to talk about how all of your states are actually collecting the data. And Jonathan, I know you just wrapped up, but I do want to start with you because I hear all the time in my work states saying industry certifications are so popular, but a lot of state post-secondary agencies or other state agencies, they don't know how to get the data because, you know, it's awarded by private entities. And so they're not regulated by the state, and the states don't have a hook per se. So can you talk about how you in Tennessee were able to get data from these private entities? Maybe share some of the tips that you have for our audience on the line, and then I can ask you later as well, but if you want to throw in some of the interesting ways that you're actually using the data, I think that would all be really fascinating for discussion. And also, if you need another slide, panelists, just say next slide.
Great, thank you. So we were hearing the similar stories from our district partners that our students were embarking into attempting these certifications. We really didn't have a good sense of how it was going, but we recognize that pathway is very important. And the slide demonstrates that how we value these certifications. As part of our state accountability system, we have 4 pathways to what we call a ready graduate. We have this ACT achievement, these early post-secondary opportunities, a military readiness exam, plus the early post-secondary opportunities, and then this one that focuses on industry certifications. So we need to be able to know not only how many, but who actually is earning these to properly understand how our schools are doing in preparing students for their next path. Next slide, please. So we started and we said, okay, well, what are we preparing our students for? Would you go, yeah, perfect. And as we were transitioning from our old programs to our new programs, we realized that we needed to do a better job aligning that to our regional labor market needs. And so right now we know that 76% of all programs across the state are aligned to the regional labor market needs. And so now from that, we can start promoting certifications in that area. That's been a real challenge. And if you go on to the next slide, I'll walk you through our process for that. So as I mentioned earlier, there are nearly 30 different vendors at this point that we've collected from that have these recognized and valued certification. And what we've had to do is to develop a memorandum of understanding, a data sharing agreement with each one to really make sure that we're securely transferring the data back and forth. So which a lot of the times meant that there was individualized outreach and communication to those certifiers. Getting that MOU signed is from a state agency, we often didn't know who to actually go to within the agency. So it was often cold calling to find out who the right person was. And we have a multiple years worth of notes of talking to different people at some of the larger organizations. From that point, we worked on trying to securely transfer the data. And we've gotten better at making that process more seamless over the past few years. The challenge from that point, I'm sorry?
Can I interrupt you briefly? I think something that I remember hearing is, and I think this will be relevant to a lot of people on the line, is you had to come up with somewhat different arguments for each of the different industry certifiers just to get them to agree to share data in the first place, right? Can you elaborate about that tactic a little bit?
Sure. I think that this is, when these certifiers are providing data, it's ultimately putting their data up for more scrutiny potentially. And so, the way that we've talked to our partners about this is that by, having a valued and recognized certification, they're increasing the pool of potential applicants and making the process more seamless and easier for people to understand their data. They're actually able to open up the pool of potential folks who are attempting this certification by just being out there in the public space. So if we're recognizing and valuing that, we can get the data and report to our schools that these students are achieving these milestones, then there's going to be more students coming down the line in the long run. And so we really used it as an opportunity for our partners to do some free advertising in the state. If right now that when we looked at the initial scope of the data, a lot of our certifications are concentrated where there was a single teacher that really knew that pushed their students along that path, or different issues in access and opportunity. But we've seen that change over time, because once it's recognized, valued, it's aligned with our programs of study, our students are being well prepared for it through their coursework. Other schools and districts are aware that their students are prepared for these certifications. It expands the pool. So it ultimately becomes free advertising for them. We have talk a little bit, we integrate this into our longitudinal data system. The biggest challenge that we've faced, aside from just general data access and finding the right people, has been that a lot of the different certifiers collect different levels of detail about the student. So there might be one agency or one organization that just collects a first name, last name, and date of birth. Another might collect the social security number or some other more unique identifier that allows us to bring the data in. We've had to use some probabilistic matching, including how students are prepared through their coursework to get the best list of students possible based on what's provided to us. So we have an annual data sharing agreement where the agencies agree to provide us data once a year. We bring it into our data system, implement business rules based on what's promoted within our state, and now we're in the process of trying to work with our district partners, who right now are our primary, and we've put this into our accountability system. So right now they're the primary audience, our local schools and districts, of how they're, which of their students are actually pursuing and earning these certifications. So it's really a year-long, process from the beginning of the data collection to the cleaning and validation to when it's reported back. And then, if districts have, if there's been some differences with matching, districts can come back and appeal that. So, we don't have a single person that's doing that right now. We've had to kind of build a team effort at this point, but I think that we've gotten better at some of those, especially at the earlier stages where we're trying to, with our career cluster consultants, develop some strong networks within their area of expertise so that we can get that data seamlessly.
So Jonathan, if I understand this correctly, Tennessee actually is sort of using your data system to match course information about K-12 students with the industry certifications to help better narrow down who's actually getting what. Right?
That's absolutely right. So every single industry certification that's promoted within Tennessee, the K-12 level, is aligned to a specific program of study or a course within a program of study. Some industry certifications are the capstone, meaning the student would go through the entire series of courses in high school and be prepared for that more advanced certification. Think like something like a certified nursing assistant that really is the capstone from a sequence of courses. Others might be like the Microsoft suite of certifications that are stackable, that might be aligned to a course earlier on. So we get all the data from the vendor, and then because there might be two John Smiths in Tennessee, that we can begin to narrow it down with the identifiable information that we have, one piece of which is what courses that student took. So that's just at sort of a secondary level. We go through a series of steps to do our probabilistic matching. One of the final things that we do to help push us in either direction is we look at the course that the student was prepared in.
And I think that's a strong example of how the value of, longitudinal data systems and being able to bring together a bunch of different types of information to really figure out who's who. So thanks so much, Jonathan. I'm gonna shift the discussion now. So Ryan, apprenticeship data for states, some states, I guess as background for those who aren't particularly familiar with the registered apprenticeship program, some states have their programs are run through a state office, and other states are run through the U.S. Department of Labor, and Iowa is one of the states whose programs are administered federally. So being that Iowa doesn't just have the data, you're not administering your own programs, can you talk a bit about how you worked with the U.S. Department of Labor to start getting that data?
Sure. So, and you can go to the next slide. It's fine. In 2008, staff from Iowa Workforce Development's Labor Market Information Division attended a conference which included a presentation regarding registered apprenticeship. And in that presentation, it was discussed how the states of Alaska and Washington were using registered apprenticeship data and how they had acquired that data from the Federal Department of Labor, and that there were also states that didn't have the data themselves, and they were able to acquire that through an MOU. Workforce Development's management and the Labor Market Information Division contacted our local office. We have a local office here in Des Moines, Iowa, from the Federal Department of Labor's Office of Registered Apprenticeship, and reached out to them to discuss how we could work towards having, attaining the same data from them. And we basically had mirrored the data sharing agreement that Alaska and Washington had, and they connected us with the Washington, D.C. office and the appropriate person in D.C. Once that connection was made, Workforce Development worked directly with D.C., the Department of Labor's Registered Apprenticeship Office in D.C. the whole time, and the individual we worked with and are currently still working with is Greg Wilson. We walked us through the MOU process since 2008 to our last renewal last summer. So we had our first data sharing agreement with the Department of Labor. It was completed in April of 2009. We have had multiple renewals of that MOU, so we basically have had a data sharing agreement with the Department of Labor's Registered Apprenticeship Office at ETA for almost a decade now. What I can say, I can't speak to how long the MOU process took in the beginning. That was before my time in my position. But I can tell you that this last time it took us approximately 9 months from the time we requested that data sharing agreement to be renewed until we had signatures from the Department of Labor and from Iowa Workforce Development. So it can be a lengthy process. There are two pieces to that data sharing agreement. The first one is the data agreement itself, which talks about the data that's going to be included, how it's going to be shared, the purposes of how the data can be used. So it's very specific to the data. The data elements are going to be brought over in that data transfer. The second part is called the Interconnection Security Agreement. Basically, this is an outline to the Department of Labor, letting them know what your security standards are at your state, so where the data is going to be housed, so that there is protection there, and they are confident that you aren't going to be careless with that data, and that it's also going to be protected not only from within your own data systems, but you have appropriate procedures, standard operating procedures for protection on your machine, so that they log out after a certain amount of time. And so what we did is we had our IT department go through that and make sure that we've updated all of the criteria that the Federal Department of Labor needed to feel comfortable making that MOU, agreeing to that MOU. It'll include things regarding firewalls, workstations, access to certain servers, and then the network security credentials that Workforce Development's IT system has. Some of the elements included in that, we have data on apprentices themselves, registered apprentices, and that includes the occupation, the registration date, start date, when they expect to complete, program ID, their location, age. It includes things like if they're a veteran, their veteran status, also if they have a disability status, gender. So those are very important for us. As you can see the slide, we've created a dashboard. I can go more detail on that, but those are the filters that we have currently used in our dashboard internally. We also have data in there considering each program. So each program has an ID, a registration date, status, industry codes, NAICS and SIC, the program location, so where that employer or that partner is, and then the active apprentice counts for them. And then we have program data as well. So there are a lot of different, there's a lot of elements within there. The Department of Labor just moved to a new data system. The previous was called Rapids, and the newest one is called Rapids 2.0, and they basically had made that move early winter of 2017, I believe, somewhere in there, and so they're still working through that. Our current MOU is active with them for 3 years, and then we'll start the renewal process.
Brian, do you want to talk a little bit about the ways that I was actually using this data? Like, if I understand correctly, you're linking it with outcomes data, and you're understanding how much apprentices are earning, right?
Yes, yep. So as I mentioned before, over the years, we have completed multiple reports related to registered apprenticeship data. Those reports typically have included program analysis of employment wages by matching that registered apprenticeship data to our agency's unemployment insurance records. So those wage records that we get quarterly. It also, as I mentioned, includes data regarding their age, gender, and industry. We've been using mapping to see where there are locations of apprentices, and also the sponsors. We received 2 registered apprenticeship grants from the Department of Labor, and so we are using some of that those grant funds to map out, try to connect possible registered apprentices with the sponsors themselves, those who own the standards. In 2014, we conducted research that related those employment and wages of registered apprentices to community college students in similar occupational programs. That analysis looked at completers that finished their respective programs within the same year, October 2010 through 2011. Consists of analyzing wages of each of the groups over 12 quarters from that completion year. Currently, though, we are receiving quarterly data updates from the Department of Labor via a secured Dropbox, and we're using that data to monitor progress for those registered apprenticeship grants and find opportunities for registered apprenticeship program expansion within our state, so that it aligns with the industries and the occupations that we are in high demand in our state, especially with our unemployment rate at just released 2.7%. We're really trying to align the people that we have who are available for work with the occupations that are in need in our state. What part of our focus too, as I had mentioned, is trying to connect certain populations of people with registered apprenticeship opportunities. So we're looking at individuals with disabilities, youth, veterans, and then we're also connecting the registered apprenticeship data to our Department of Corrections data. Our Department of Corrections has some registered apprenticeship programs, and so we're looking at how well those individuals are faring in the workforce after the release, if they've completed a registered apprenticeship. And we've created dashboards for all of these, and we're working with our stakeholders to make sure that those dashboards are answering the questions they need answered. Over the last year, our workforce development, like I said, we've been working with the Department of Corrections. We've been connecting that data to our unemployment insurance wage records. These programs with the Department of Corrections are relatively new. So we don't have a lot of participants yet, but we're allowing, hopefully over time, we'll accumulate more of those. And one thing too is that they're fairly new, so that also limits the amount of wage data that we have to match to. So we're waiting for, we need more time for participants to complete and also for them to be able to collect that wage data after completion. That will help solidify our analysis on that group of people.
Thanks, Ryan.
Sure.
Are the slides still up for everybody?
Jen, I do want to also mention that we are working with our community colleges to on a report on non-credit programs through the community colleges, and also matching that to wage data, employment data. So we're working on both fronts as you are the other states.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. It sounds like you're doing a lot of work comparing pathways and really figuring out, how you're going to get state folks into those best jobs. I know we're running a little bit low on time, so I want to make sure to get to Jeremy. Jeremy, can you talk about Missouri? You're collecting non-credit data from the community and technical colleges. And I know that in a lot of states, community colleges aren't super excited to do this. They tend to keep the data in different systems and it's in a different format. So can you talk just a little bit, somewhat briefly, maybe keep it to 5 or so minutes about the process for getting data from them and making it easy. And then also I know you're using this data, so talking about that as well.
So you can advance to the next slide, Jenna, thank you. So we got $20 million, and that helped, as it often does. We got a Trade Act grant from the U.S. Department of Labor that allowed us to do a handful of things, one of which was about 3/4 of the money, roughly, went to expanding programs on the ground for students. But about 1/4 of the money went to a couple of different things, sort of statewide, one of which was number one, as you said, to collect non-credit data in a standardized way, which we hadn't done before. And number two was to integrate that into our workforce longitudinal data system and to create a website, a portal where students could go and they could look at those outcomes. And I think historically, maybe Missouri has been, lots of states are doing that on the credit side. And historically, maybe Missouri's been a little behind on the credit side in building that centralized portal. But I think we're going to be ahead of the curve on the non-credit side, which is, it isn't something that a lot of states have been able to do. So how did we do that besides resources, which are always nice? One of which is that we were able to use some of that to provide some resources to the colleges to be able to hire a half FTE to assist with bringing this data out of those various systems into a standardized form. Because as you mentioned, they are all sorts of different forms, data systems, storage mechanisms, and we were able to provide some assistance for those institutions to be able to bring that forward. And next slide. So we were able to do that. We were also able to, I think, develop a standardized format. One of the things we did is historically we've had a portal, a website for the institutions to submit their credit data to us and allow it to be validated, to go through business rules, to sort of give them immediate feedback on the extent to which the data is clean. They push the button, they certify it, it flows into our data system. We've been doing that on the credit side for years. One of the things we were able to do to make the institutions comfortable was to put the non-credit data into that same portal. We had some resources to be able to work with our vendor to be able to build that collection. So it was something they were used to seeing. The feedback they got, the validation they got was something they'd been able to do before. So to the extent making them comfortable. Once it was a grant requirement, it was something we all knew we had to do, but we were also able to do it in a way that they were familiar with, they were comfortable with. To the extent there were fears about this, institutions were afraid, I think, to the extent, I don't say afraid, but we're a little bit leery of the fact that asking for some additional data on and from these students who participate in these customized training programs, non-credit programs that they haven't asked for before, might spook some students, turn some students away. So for example, Social Security numbers, always going to be optional. We weren't going to require institutions to require them to get SSNs from students, but what we said is, you have to ask. You have to at least present an opportunity for students to give that data to you, because we want to be able to link to wage data And you can't do that by fuzzy matching. At least we in Missouri can't. We can't do that by probabilistic matching. We have to have an SSN. So that was a hurdle that we had to get through, I think. But the other piece was just in terms of, you know, making the institutions comfortable, was that we went through a lot of iterations on this data template with them. It was sort of developing what we were going to collect and what form it was going to take was absolutely a collaborative effort with them. So when we got to the point where it was, this is the template you need to give us, it wasn't a surprise, it wasn't a shock, it wasn't something that they hadn't had a chance to vet. So that was important. So once we've got that, we're building our portal, we're building our scorecard. As it says on your slide there, we're going to provide public and institutional reports on completion and on workforce outcomes. There's going to be stuff everybody can see. There's going to be stuff on a slightly more granular level behind logon that the institutions can see and use, so that's a benefit to them. Again, it leverages existing collection of student credit data. We already had the data from the credit side. We didn't need to add to that. And also the other piece, that last piece there, I'll emphasize too. In our data warehouse, this is probably true for many of you, but many, if not all of you, but in our data warehouse, behind the scorecard, all of our student and earnings data are de-identified. We do the linkage, then we create a research, a new ID, and strip all that other information out of there in a way that is hashed, that it can't be restored. So an additional protection on top of all of the privacy and encryption protections that, you know, state IT can offer where the data are stored. So next slide, please. So we're continuing to slightly redesign this. It looks a little bit more graphically engaging even now than what I'm showing you here. But there's a site that the public is going to be able to go to, students and workers are going to be able to go to. They're going to be able to search by program, search by degree or credential, search by field of study, search by location, and figure out, you know, find a program that suits them. One of the interesting challenges for this is that institutions have for some years been putting programs through for approval with the Department of Higher Education, with us, but have also been putting them through in a separate process for annual recertification with the state eligible training provider system, which are the programs that are eligible for WIOA funds. So it has been kind of an interesting experience for us. We want this scorecard to present a unified program inventory of credit and non-credit programs. So one of the things we've had to do is develop a methodology for merging the information on programs we have at DHE with what our state's Division of Workforce Development had, in order to put those together, eliminate the duplicates, identify the programs that were being reported to both, and create a unified program inventory that could be the basis of the scorecard. So that has been an interesting challenge, and I think it's something that we've made a lot of progress on. But we want to make sure this is as user-friendly for students as we can. But I won't show you all the tabs here in the interest of time. But what students do, they can go in, they can select, they get a list of programs from search, and then they can select a program, they can get information on site and program. Now, next slide, Jenna. And this, of course, is the piece that's been really new for us. They can go in and they can see, based on that de-identified linkage of student credit, non-credit, and workforce data, they can see median earnings for the first year and third year post-completion from that student at that institution in that program. We've rolled up to 4-digit zip codes, so there's a little bit, you know, so we have cells that are a little bit larger so we can get more results, but in similar programs at least. We've got the second and third year credential rates. This happens to be an associate's degree, so this is basically analogous to the 100 and 150% completion, and those time frames are different for different programs. But here we've got second and third year credential rates, again, for that student in that program at that institution compared to the statewide average. The shaded area is the institution there, and then the bar is the statewide average or median, depending on the measure. Then down there at the bottom, we've also got first and third year employment rates for all our programs. And again, we show the shaded areas there for the student, and then the bar, the line across the top there, and the smaller numbers there represent the statewide figure. We also, Jenny, you mentioned demographics a little bit earlier. I didn't have a slide on this, but we also do have some graphs that show demographics of the students in the program compared to similar programs across the state. And we're doing age groups, we're doing gender, we're doing race, ethnicity, so students can really see the composition of those programs in the context of all of this other information. So we're excited about it.
You're releasing this soon, right? This is supposed to be public pretty shortly?
We are releasing this soon. Matter of fact, we've already shared it with the institutions for vetting as well. Our go live date has migrated a little bit over the course of the summer, just because we want to be sure, obviously that we get it right, the calculations doing everything that we want them to do. But our grant ends in September, so we are committed to have this out by then at the latest. We hope, obviously, it'll be quite a bit sooner than that. But it is coming, and we're excited about it.
And when that happens, WDQC will definitely make sure that all of you are able to access it. We're running a little short on time, Jeremy, so I hope you don't mind if I cut you off. I just want to make sure that there's a chance to at least ask one or two questions before we wrap up.
Sure, thank you.
Shortly before that, a lot of the folks on this webinar are agency staff, but a lot of them are also employers or working at CBOs, community colleges. Can maybe just one of you talk a little bit about what non-state employees can do to move the ball forward here? Like, is there anything that they can do despite not being at a state agency to make sure that states are able to know more about who's obtaining a non-degree credential in their state?
This is Jeremy again. I'll jump in. I'll just say that I think one of the important things that you all can do is to continue asking the questions of your local representatives, of your stakeholders, of your legislators, of your institutions, to provide the momentum for this data to be out there. I mean, just that. And again, we want to do it in a way that's obviously respectful of privacy. That's huge. That's important, and we've given a lot of consideration to that. But we don't want to let that be a roadblock to being able to link these data systems and provide that information. And there's so much anxiety around this at times that's been an important conversation that we've had to have and that we've had to have repeatedly. So just keep asking the questions, tell the policymakers these credentials have value, and again, just continue to advocate for that for that data collection and use.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. And agency staff, I just want to reiterate, I think all of our panelists on this webinar are going to be happy to talk to you about the work you're doing. You can look to your peers who are already doing some of these best practices to get advice. You're welcome to reach out to WDQC. We are happy to help any state that's interested in collecting more non-degree credentials data to help you with that. We only have a couple minutes left. So just in brief summary, I hope that you're all coming away from this webinar with some sort of understanding of why non-degree credentials have value and how they're helpful towards narrowing the skills gap, and also just that it's really helpful to start gathering this data and incorporating it into your SLDS. If you need assistance, reach out to WDQC. I think we have time for just a couple of questions, and we might go 1 or 2 minutes over. But I want to turn it over to WDQC's director, Brian Wilson, who has been dutifully combing through your questions that you've been asking during this entire webinar. So, Brian.
Thank you, Jenna. So just we'll need to be really quick here. So a number of folks did ask if the slides will be made available, and yes, we will make the slides from the webinar available to everyone. One of the questions we got several variations of is about the acceptance of non-degree credentials as qualifying credentials for the Credential Attainment Performance Indicator for WIOA. That's a little outside the scope of this webinar. I recommend suggest you turn to your state PACIA, your Performance Accountability and Consumer Information Agency. And if they are unable to answer, or if you work at the PACIA and it's unclear to you, be your regional office of the Department of Labor that you should turn to. There's requests for additional information and information about particular states. Our publication, Measuring Non-Degree Credentials, 50-State Scan, is on the National Skills Coalition website. Just go to nationalskillscoalition.org. On the homepage, you'll see a place where publications are listed, and you'll see that publication. That includes the results from each of the 50 states and DC for the questions that were asked. And there are other questions that we will try to respond to by text after the webinar, and appreciate everyone's attendance today.
Thanks so much, Brian. We're going to wrap it up, but as Brian said, we will try to at least answer some of the questions via email if you mailed in a question. Thank you all for joining us today, and feel free to reach out with any other questions.